Last week, the Cypriot president announced that he wanted to use Cyprus's upcoming presidency at the Council of the European Union to mend relations with Turkey, in the hopes of advancing Cyprus's NATO bid. This is a remarkable volte-face from a country that has historically pursued a foreign policy of state neutrality, and was refusing to countenance NATO membership as recently as 2022. So, in this video, we're going to look at this new plan, and whether it could actually get Cyprus into NATO. Who is the most influential person in the world? Each year we ask the audience to rank their top 10 most influential people across politics, media, culture and activism. And now it's time for you to have your say. Click the link in the description to cast your vote for our 2026 ranking. So, to understand why Cyprus has only recently expressed an interest in joining NATO, you need a bit of context. In short, Cyprus has been divided into a Turkish Cypriot North and a Greek Cypriot South since Turkish forces invaded in 1974, in response to a Greek-backed coup. Turkish forces quickly captured the island's northern third, provoking a tragic episode of ethnic cleansing and population transfer, with some 165,000 Greek Cypriots fleeing or driven from the north and some 45,000 Turkish Cypriots displaced in the other direction. This resulted in the effective partition of the island, with a Greek Cypriot South and Turkish Cypriot North separated by a UN-administered buffer zone. UN Security Council resolutions that called on Turkey to withdraw from Cyprus went unheeded, and in 1983, Turkish Cypriots unilaterally proclaimed the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. To this day, only Turkey recognises Northern Cyprus, while the rest of the international community recognises the Republic of Cyprus as the legitimate government of the island. This obviously left Cyprus caught between its larger neighbours, Turkey and Greece, which is the main reason that Cyprus has historically pursued a foreign policy of non-alignment or neutrality. In other words, actively trying to make sure it's not seen as too closely associated with a particular ideological bloc. Cyprus's first president, Makarios III, took part in the 1961 founding meeting of the Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM, in Belgrade, and Cyprus showed no interest in joining NATO. Cyprus did join the EU in 2004, but while this did require Cyprus to relinquish its membership in NAM, it wasn't considered a real violation of state neutrality, both because the EU didn't really have a military or security aspect at the time, and because there were already a couple of nominally neutral countries in the EU, like Ireland and Austria. It's also worth mentioning that, while today this might look like Cyprus moving closer to Greece and further away from Turkey, given that Greece is a member of the EU and Turkey isn't, at the time it didn't really feel like that, because there was a widespread expectation that Turkey would also eventually join the EU. Anyway, you get the idea. Even though it's been a member of the EU since 2004, Cyprus has long pursued a foreign policy of neutrality. This is why, unlike most other EU members, Cyprus had no interest in joining NATO. It's one of 4 EU countries outside NATO, and the only member state which is not part of NATO's Partnership for Peace, or PFP initiative. That was until November last year, when Cyprus's President Nikos Christodoulidis revealed a plan to deepen Cyprus's relationship with NATO and eventually join as a full member. Christodoulidis has recently reiterated his interest in joining NATO, telling HuffPost in October that, quote, "I would apply to NATO if I knew they'd say yes." The big obstacle to Cyprus's NATO aspirations, however, is Turkey, which is a NATO member and thus has a veto over Cyprus's potential accession. Somewhat unsurprisingly, given the tense state of Cyprus-Turkey relations, Turkey has signalled it won't let Cyprus into NATO, while the long-standing territorial dispute on the island remains unresolved. Apparently undeterred, however, last week Christodoulidis told Politico he had come up with a new plan to at least get Cyprus closer to NATO. Broadly speaking, the basic idea is to use Cyprus's upcoming presidency of the Council of the EU to bring Turkey closer to the EU, in exchange for Turkey letting Cyprus get closer to NATO. For context, the presidency of the Council rotates among the EU member states every 6 months, and in January, Cyprus will take over from Denmark, which will give Cyprus more sway over the EU's agenda. Anyway, how would this plan actually work in practice? Well, for example, Christodoulidis suggested Cyprus would ask Turkey to let it join NATO's Partnership for Peace programme, which is seen as a first step towards NATO membership, And in exchange, Cyprus could use its position at the helm of the Council to push for Turkey's inclusion in the EU Security Action for Europe, or SAFE scheme, a €150 billion EU defence procurement scheme that Turkey is currently excluded from, meaning the money isn't going to be spent on Turkish-made weapons systems, despite the fact that Turkey has a well-developed and well-regarded defence industry. To give another potential example, Turkey might withdraw its veto on NATO sharing classified data with the European Defence Agency, an EU intergovernmental body that obviously includes Cyprus. In exchange, Cyprus might push for more favourable visa rules for Turkish citizens, which is something Turkey has wanted for a while. So, would it work? Could this actually get Cyprus into NATO? Well, it might help Cyprus get closer to NATO, although Christodoulou leaders would be wise to note that Erdogan generally drives a pretty hard bargain. This became apparent in 2023, when Erdogan refused to let Sweden and Finland into NATO, nominally because he wanted them to drop their alleged support for Kurdish separatist groups and their unofficial embargoes on Turkish arms exports. But it was pretty clear that Erdogan was also using his veto to extract concessions from other NATO members. Most notably, Turkey wanted the US to sign off on the sale of F-16 fighter jets, which is exactly what happened in the end. 4 days after the Turkish parliament approved Sweden's NATO bid, the Biden administration announced it had approved a $23 billion sale of F-16s. The point we're trying to make is that if Cyprus wants to extract genuine concessions from Erdogan, it might have to pay a high price. And even if it did help Cyprus get closer to NATO, it's hard to see Turkey letting Cyprus actually join the alliance without a resolution of the territorial issue. This might happen, and the landslide victory of the pro-unification candidate Tufan Erman at October's presidential election in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has breathed new life into negotiations, but probably not anytime soon. It's also worth noting that there's at least a chance that NATO will be essentially frozen as part of any Ukraine peace deal. This might sound far-fetched, but in comments made earlier this week, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov seemed to imply that Russia wanted to return NATO to its pre-2022 borders, which would mean kicking Sweden and Finland out of the alliance and banning any more states from joining it. Of course, it's hard to imagine European leaders accepting the idea of Sweden and Finland being kicked out, but a temporary ban on further NATO expansion feels at least possible, which would throw a spanner into the works from Cyprus's perspective. Now, as a viewer of TLDR News, we know that you're a details person. So you probably check at least a half dozen reviews by forming an opinion, or making a big ticket purchase. You'd read the nutritional information on cereal boxes. You even read the terms and conditions for some app you almost downloaded. So, when you're giving to charity, why should this be any different? Well, today's sponsor GiveWell provides you with those details as an independent resource for rigorous, transparent research about great giving opportunities. For example, their recent analysis of the effect of cash transfers in poor regions of Africa contains over 300 footnotes, which might satisfy even the most meticulous readers. That's because GiveWell has spent 18 years researching global health and poverty alleviation and only directs funding to the highest impact opportunities they've found. These are things like preventative medication for malaria. It costs about $7 to provide a child with malaria treatment through the high malaria season. These treatments can reduce the number of malaria infections and, with enough treatments, also save a life in expectation. Over 150,000 donors have already trusted GiveWell to direct more than $2.5 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 300,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And thanks to the donors who chose to sponsor their research, GiveWell doesn't take a cut from your tax-deductible donation to their recommended funds. And if this is your first gift through GiveWell, you can even have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To do so, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout so they know you heard about GiveWell from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.